The clinking of crystal glasses and soft jazz at l'Espérance shattered the moment three men in heavy wool coats bypassed the hostess. Nobody noticed the shift in atmospheric pressure, nobody except a quiet single father, slicing his daughter's steak, whose forgotten, lethal muscle memory had already begun mapping the room. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of l'Espérance, a Michelin-starred sanctuary nestled on the corner of 5th Avenue and 55th Street in Midtown Manhattan. Inside, the world was a masterclass in curated luxury. The air smelled faintly of truffle oil, roasted duck, and expensive perfume. The lighting was low, designed to cast flattering shadows over the faces of Wall Street tycoons, minor royalty, and the city's power brokers. In a secluded corner booth, shielded by a large, imported ficus and the discreet architecture of the restaurant, sat Sylvia Caldwell. At 43, Sylvia was the reigning architect of the tech logistics sector. Just 3 hours earlier, she had finalized the hostile takeover of a major competitor, securing her status as a self-made billionaire. The financial press had already dubbed her the Iron Queen of Silicon Alley. Tonight, however, she was just a profoundly exhausted woman nursing a glass of a 2012 vintage Pinot Noir. She had dismissed her private security detail, a seasoned professional named Thomas, to wait in the armored Lincoln Navigator parked down the block. She had craved exactly 20 minutes of absolute, uninterrupted silence. It was a fatal miscalculation. 3 tables away, sitting perilously close to the main thoroughfare of the dining room, was Arthur Pendleton. By all outward appearances, Arthur was profoundly ordinary. He wore a slightly faded corduroy blazer over a neat, though unexceptional, button-down shirt. He had the soft, tired eyes of a man who graded sophomore history papers until midnight. Tonight was a rare, financially irresponsible splurge to celebrate his daughter Lily's 8th birthday. Lily, wearing a velvet dress that was slightly too big for her, was currently swinging her legs beneath the heavy oak table, eyes wide as she studied the gold-leafed dessert menu. "Can I really get the chocolate dome, Dad?" she asked, her voice a soft, bell-like chime over the hum of the restaurant. "The one they light on fire?" "You only turn 8 once, Bug," Arthur smiled, reaching across the white linen tablecloth to tuck a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. His smile was genuine, but his eyes, if one looked closely, were constantly in motion. They flicked to the kitchen doors, measured the distance to the emergency exit, and noted the exact placement of the waitstaff. It was an involuntary reflex, a ghost from a past life he had sworn to bury when his wife, Sarah, had lost her battle with leukemia 5 years ago. Before the corduroy blazers and the lesson plans on the French Revolution, Arthur had not been a teacher. He had been a problem solver, specifically a tier, one asset for a highly classified kinetic operations group operating loosely under the umbrella of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He had spent his 20s operating in the shadows of Kandahar, Bogota, and Grozny. He had traded violence for domesticity, promising Sarah on her deathbed that he would give Lily a life entirely free of the darkness that had defined his youth. At exactly 8:14 p.m., the polished brass handle of the restaurant's heavy mahogany front door turned. 3 men stepped into the foyer. Arthur's conversation with his daughter didn't stop, but his internal alarm system, dormant for half a decade, violently flared to life. The maitre d', a distinguished man named Henri, stepped forward with a welcoming smile, but the men ignored him. They were dressed in dark, heavy wool overcoats, despite the restaurant's stifling warmth. Arthur's trained eyes immediately broke them down. Target 1, the leader. Mid-30s, Eastern European facial structure, prominent cauliflower ear, indicative of extensive grappling or sambo experience. His eyes weren't scanning the room for an open table. They were scanning for cameras, locking onto the blinking red light of the CCTV dome above the bar. Target 2, flanking the left. Heavy set, his right hand buried deep in the pocket of his coat, the fabric pulled taut in a way that screamed the geometric outline of a suppressed firearm. Target 3, trailing slightly, securing the rear, already turning his body to block the main exit. This was not a robbery. Robbers came in loud, relying on shock and awe. These men were moving with the synchronized, quiet precision of a targeted hit team. Arthur watched as the leader's eyes swept the room and locked onto the secluded booth in the back. He locked onto Sylvia Caldwell. "Lily," Arthur said. His voice was entirely level, betraying absolutely no panic, but the warmth had vanished from it, replaced by a chilling, absolute authority. Lily looked up from her menu, surprised by the tone. "Dad, we are going to play the silent game right now. Do you remember the rules?" Lily hesitated, sensing the sudden shift in her father's posture. He was sitting perfectly straight now, his hands resting flat on the table. "Hide and don't make a sound until you say the magic word," she whispered. "Exactly. I need you to slide under the table. Right now. Go all the way to the back, against the wall. Do not look out. But my dessert, Lily. Now." She slipped off her chair and vanished beneath the heavy drapery of the tablecloth, just as the three men bypassed the bewildered maitre d', pushing him aside with enough force to send the older man crashing into a cart of expensive champagne. The glass shattered, the sharp, explosive sound cutting through the low jazz. The dining room went dead silent. The illusion of safety in the upscale Manhattan enclave evaporated in an instant. Sylvia Caldwell looked up from her wine glass at the sound of the shattering crystal. Her mind, usually a steel trap of strategic planning and risk assessment, took a crucial second to process the anomaly. She saw the three men advancing down the central aisle, their eyes fixed directly on her. The heavy-set man drew his hand from his pocket. The metallic glint of a suppressed Stekkin automatic pistol caught the ambient light of the chandeliers. "Miss Caldwell, the leader, the man with the cauliflower ear," said. His accent was thick, Russian, his voice carrying clearly over the sudden, terrified gasps of the patrons. "You are coming with us." Quietly, a waiter, young and paralyzed by panic, stumbled out of the kitchen doors directly into their path. Without breaking stride, the third man, the rear guard, snapped a brutal, compact punch to the waiter's throat. The boy collapsed instantly, choking on the floor. Screams finally erupted. Patrons scrambled, diving under tables or bolting toward the restrooms. Sylvia froze. Her phone was on the table, her security was outside, and the distance between her and the muzzle of the gun was less than 20 feet. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, but there was nowhere to run. She was boxed into the corner booth. "Grab her," the leader barked. The heavy-set man with the gun stepped forward to close the distance, passing right by the table where a mild-mannered man in a corduroy blazer was sitting alone. Arthur hadn't moved. He had taken those 10 seconds to calculate trajectories, assess the weaponry, and locate the vital strike points on the men. He had promised Sarah he would never return to this life. But as the gunman stepped past him, leaving his flank exposed, Arthur realized that doing nothing meant letting the violence spill over. If they started shooting, rounds would go through drywall. Rounds would go through tables. A round could go through the oak table hiding his daughter. Arthur stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't adopt a theatrical fighting stance. He moved with a terrifying, liquid efficiency that defied his unassuming appearance. As the gunman passed, Arthur's left hand shot out, clamping down on the man's gun wrist with the crushing force of a steel vise. He didn't try to wrestle the gun away. Instead, he rotated his hips, using the man's forward momentum against him, and drove the heel of his right palm directly into the elbow joint. A loud, sickening crack echoed through the dining room, louder than the shattered champagne glasses. The gunman didn't even have time to scream. The joint inverted completely. As the man's arm buckled, Arthur twisted the wrist, forcing the suppressed pistol to point harmlessly at the ceiling before stripping it from the suddenly numb fingers. In a single, fluid continuation of the movement, Arthur spun, bringing the heavy steel grip of the pistol crashing down onto the bridge of the gunman's nose. The man folded like wet paper, hitting the floor completely unconscious. It had taken exactly 2.4 seconds. Sylvia Caldwell gasped, her eyes wide with shock. The leader and the rear guard stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the crumpled body of their comrade and then at the average-looking father standing over him. The leader's hand went inside his coat. "Kill him!" he yelled in Russian. Arthur didn't wait. He threw the stolen pistol directly at the rear guard's face. The heavy weapon struck the man squarely in the jaw, staggering him backward. Simultaneously, Arthur closed the gap between himself and the leader. The Russian leader was a trained fighter. He managed to pull a combat knife from his coat and lunged, aiming a lethal upward thrust at Arthur's abdomen. Arthur sidestepped the blade by a fraction of an inch, the cold steel slicing through his blazer. He parried the attacking arm from the outside, stepped into the leader's personal space, and executed a flawless, devastating sequence. He struck the man's throat with an open hand strike, temporarily collapsing his airway, then swept the leader's front leg. As the large man fell, Arthur maintained control of the knife arm, dropping his own knee directly onto the man's ribs with the full weight of his body. The ribs shattered under the impact. Arthur pinned the man to the floor, wrenching the knife from his grip and pressing the blade casually, almost gently, against the Russian's carotid artery. The restaurant was in absolute pandemonium, yet a bizarre pocket of silence surrounded the center aisle. The rear guard, recovering from the pistol thrown to his face, spat blood onto the floor and reached for a weapon at his waist. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the knife pressed against his boss's throat. Then, the rear guard's eyes widened. He stared intently at the faded, star-shaped scar visible just below Arthur's jawline, a souvenir from a brutal interrogation in Chechnya a decade ago. The rear guard's face drained of color. He stopped reaching for his weapon. His hands began to tremble. He recognized the man standing in front of him. He recognized the ghost. "It's you," the rear guard whispered, his voice cracking, backing slowly toward the exit. "The Reaper of Grozny." Arthur didn't flinch. His eyes, devoid of any warmth or humanity, locked onto the remaining attacker. "Leave," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying calm of a natural disaster. "Or I will show you what I did to the others." The rear guard didn't need to be told twice. The myth of the Reaper of Grozny, a phantom operative who had systematically dismantled an entire terror cell in the Argonne Gorge during the winter of 2009, was a bedtime story used to terrify young syndicate recruits. To see the scar, to see the impossible speed, was enough. The man stumbled backward, his dress shoes slipping on the spilled Pinot Noir, before he turned and sprinted out the shattered glass doors into the relentless Manhattan rain. Arthur did not pursue him. His breathing was remarkably steady, his heart rate already decelerating to a resting rhythm. He stood up, wiping the blade of the combat knife on the unconscious leader's expensive wool coat before tossing the weapon onto a nearby serving tray. The metallic clatter seemed to break the spell over the room. Patrons began to scream again, a delayed shockwave of hysteria. Sirens wailed in the distance, a rising chorus echoing off the skyscrapers of Fifth Avenue. Arthur turned his back on the carnage, ignoring the stares of the terrified elite, and walked back to his table. He knelt on the hardwood floor, lifting the heavy white linen tablecloth. Lily was curled into a tight ball, her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She was trembling so violently that the floorboards vibrated. "Lily," Arthur said softly, the lethal ice in his voice entirely replaced by the warm, desperate tenderness of a father. "The game is over, sweetheart. You won. You did perfectly." She opened her eyes, tears spilling over her eyelashes, and threw herself into his arms. Arthur held her tight against his chest, shielding her face from the sight of the broken men bleeding on the restaurant floor. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her strawberry shampoo, grounding himself in the only reality that mattered to him anymore. "Are the bad men gone?" she mumbled against his shoulder. "They're taking a nap," Arthur lied smoothly, rubbing her back. "The police are coming to pick them up. We're going to go home now." "Wait." The voice was sharp, accustomed to absolute obedience. Arthur turned slowly, keeping Lily shielded against his body. Sylvia Caldwell had stepped out of her booth. Despite the chaos, despite the fact that she had been seconds away from a violent abduction, the billionaire CEO had regained a terrifying degree of composure. She smoothed the front of her tailored Armani blazer and looked at Arthur. Her dark eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wide with a mixture of shock, profound gratitude, and intense, burning curiosity. "You can't leave," Sylvia said, her voice dropping lower as the flashing red and blue lights of the first NYPD cruisers painted the restaurant windows. "The police are going to lock this place down, and I need to know who you are. You just saved my life." "I was protecting my daughter," Arthur replied flatly. "You being alive is just a tactical byproduct." Before Sylvia could respond, the heavy mahogany doors were violently kicked open, not by the police, but by a mountain of a man in a tailored charcoal suit, an earpiece spiraling into his collar. It was Thomas, Sylvia's head of security. He swept the room with a drawn Glock 19, his eyes locking onto the bodies on the floor, then onto Arthur. "Miss Caldwell, get behind me!" Thomas roared, aiming the weapon squarely at Arthur's chest. "Stand down, Thomas," Sylvia barked, stepping directly between her security chief and the single father. "He's the one who stopped them. You, on the other hand, are 10 minutes late to an assassination attempt." Thomas lowered the weapon slightly, looking at the devastation. He looked at the shattered arm of the first gunman and the crushed chest cavity of the leader. He was a former Navy SEAL, and it took him exactly 3 seconds to read the biomechanics of the violence on the floor. Whoever the guy in the corduroy jacket was, he wasn't a civilian hero who got lucky. He was an apex predator. The NYPD poured in moments later. The scene devolved into organized chaos. Detectives separated the witnesses, paramedics loaded the moaning Russian operatives onto stretchers, and the crime scene unit began documenting the blood spatter. Arthur sat quietly on a leather bench near the coat check, Lily fast asleep in his lap, exhausted by the adrenaline crash. A seasoned homicide detective named John Callahan approached, flipping open a notepad. Callahan had the weary look of a man who had seen too many rich people behave badly, but tonight he was just confused. "Mr. Pendleton," Callahan said, glancing at the driver's license Arthur had handed him. "High school history teacher, widower, clean record, not even a parking ticket." Callahan paused, looking over his shoulder at the leader of the hit squad being wheeled out. "Care to explain how a guy who grades essays on the Magna Carta dismantled 2 operators from the Volkov Syndicate with his bare hands?" "I took some Krav Maga classes at the YMCA in Brooklyn." Arthur lied seamlessly. "Adrenaline did the rest." Callahan stared at him. "Right, the YMCA. Listen to me, Mr. Pendleton. We ran the prints on the guy you put a dent in. His name is Yuri Rostova. He's ex-FSB, currently running high-end corporate espionage and wet work for oligarchs. These guys don't get beaten by YMCA hobbyists." "Then I guess I'm a fast learner, detective. Can I take my daughter home now?" Callahan sighed, closing his notepad. "Don't leave the city." As Arthur stood, carefully shifting Lily into his arms, a shadow fell over him. It was Sylvia Caldwell. She had bypassed the police tape, her influence radiating so strongly that the uniforms didn't dare stop her. "Mr. Pendleton," she said softly, handing him a sleek, black business card with nothing but a phone number embossed in silver. "I don't believe in coincidences, and I certainly don't believe in the YMCA. Whoever you used to be, I need him." Arthur didn't take the card. "I'm a father, Miss Caldwell. That's all I am." "For now," Sylvia countered, her eyes locking onto his. "But those men didn't come here to rob me. They came because my company just executed a hostile takeover of Kestrel Global, a logistics firm that secretly manufactures guidance chips for European defense drones. The Volkov Syndicate was hired to stop the acquisition. They failed tonight, but they will try again." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And your face is now burned into the memory of the one who got away. You are in this now, Arthur, whether you want to be or not." Arthur stared at her, the cold realization settling in his gut. He looked down at his sleeping daughter. Sylvia was right. The ghost was out of the machine. By 3 a.m., the adrenaline had completely bled out of Arthur's system, leaving a hollow, freezing exhaustion in its wake. He sat in the dark living room of his modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, a glass of cheap tap water resting untouched on his knee. He had checked the locks 3 times. He had wedged a wooden chair under the front doorknob. He had pulled a dusty, oil-wrapped lockbox from the false bottom of his bedroom closet and assembled the Sig Sauer P-226 inside it with blindfolded muscle memory. The gun now sat on the coffee table, a heavy, black anchor tying him back to a past he hated. In the next room, Lily was sleeping soundly, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Arthur listened to the rhythm of her breathing, the steady in-out that anchored his sanity. His mind was racing, compiling threat assessments. The Volkov Syndicate, ex-FSB, highly organized, deeply funded, and utterly ruthless. They didn't forgive, and they didn't leave loose ends. The man who fled L'Espérance, the rear guard, had recognized him. The name Reaper of Grozny was a moniker Arthur hadn't heard in 6 years. It meant the Russians would cross-reference their old intelligence files. They would find his real name. They would find his address. They would find Lily. The burner phone in Arthur's pocket buzzed. It was a sterile, untraceable device he had kept active for absolute emergencies. Only one person had the number. He answered it without speaking. "Arthur," a voice crackled through the secure line. It was Agent Harrison, his former handler at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Harrison sounded old, tired, and deeply stressed. I just got a red flag from a biometric scrub out of an NYPD precinct. Tell me you didn't leave fingerprints on a Russian national in Midtown Manhattan. He had a knife, Harrison. It was unavoidable. A heavy sigh echoed over the line. I scrubbed the local database. I buried the file under a classified national security directive. Detective Callahan thinks his system crashed. But Arthur, the Russians already pulled the security footage from the restaurant's cloud backup before the NYPD could secure it. They have your face. Arthur closed his eyes. The room felt suffocatingly small. Who is the contractor? We intercepted chatter out of St. Petersburg 20 minutes ago. The hit was ordered by a shadow subsidiary of the Volkovs. They were paid to extract Sylvia Caldwell, force her to sign over the controlling shares of Kestrel Global, and then make her disappear. But here is the terrifying part, Arthur. The Volkovs didn't orchestrate the breach. They bought the intelligence. Bought it from who? An inside man, Harrison said grimly. Someone in Caldwell's inner circle gave the Russians her exact schedule, the exact moment she dismissed her security, and the exact booth she was sitting in. The hit was an inside job. Arthur looked at the silver-embossed business card he had taken from Sylvia Caldwell before leaving the restaurant. It sat next to the Sig Sauer. Can the agency offer protection? You know we can't, Harrison replied, his voice laced with genuine regret. You officially died in a helicopter crash in 2018. If the DIA swoops in to protect a school teacher in Queens, it blows your cover entirely, and the Senate Intelligence Committee will have a field day. You are on your own, my friend. Take the girl and run. The line went dead. Arthur sat in the silence. Running meant looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. It meant calling Lily out of school, changing her name, stripping her of the normal life Sarah had begged him to give her. Running was not a solution. It was a delay of execution. He picked up Sylvia Caldwell's card and dialed the number. It rang exactly once before she answered. I knew you'd call, Sylvia said. She didn't sound like she was in bed. She sounded wide awake, the ambient hum of servers buzzing in the background. Agent Harrison scrubbed my file, but the Russians have the video, Arthur stated, dispensing with pleasantries. My daughter is exposed because I stepped in to save you. I hold you responsible for that. A fair assessment, Sylvia replied coolly. I have resources, Mr. Pendleton. More resources than your government friends. I own a fortified estate in the Adirondacks. It has a subterranean safe room, biometric blast doors, and a private runway. It is completely off the grid. Your daughter will be safer there than anywhere else on Earth. And what do you want in exchange for this fortress, Miss Caldwell? I want the ghost, she said, her voice turning razor sharp. The police are useless. My own security chief, Thomas, is a suspect. Someone in my C-suite sold me to the Volkov syndicate. I am sitting on top of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and I am entirely surrounded by wolves. I need someone who operates outside the law, outside the system, to find the rat and tear out its throat. Arthur looked toward the hallway leading to Lily's room. He hated the violence. He hated the man he became when the switches flipped in his head. But he loved his daughter more than his own soul. Send a heavily armored transport to my address in 20 minutes, Arthur said, his voice dropping into the familiar, chilling cadence of the operator he used to be. No marked cars, no local security. Send your personal driver. If anyone follows us, I will kill them. Done, Sylvia said. Welcome to the board, Mr. Pendleton. 25 minutes later, an armored Mercedes-Benz Maybach, idling silently in the alleyway behind Arthur's apartment building, spirited them away into the darkness. Lily slept the entire time in the back seat, her head resting on Arthur's lap. By sunrise, they arrived at the Adirondack estate, a sprawling, brutalist masterpiece of concrete and glass hidden deep within a private pine forest. Sylvia Caldwell was waiting for them in the grand foyer, flanked by 2 private military contractors she had flown in from London overnight. She led Arthur into a high-tech command center overlooking the mountains. A massive digital board displayed the faces of her executive board, her security team, and her major shareholders. We start here, Sylvia said, tossing a thick dossier onto the glass table. My chief operating officer, Richard Sterling. He pushed hardest against the Kestrel Global acquisition. He claimed the liability was too high. But my forensic accountants just found a shell company tied to his ex-wife's maiden name. It received a wire transfer of 5 million euros from a bank in Cyprus yesterday morning. Arthur picked up the dossier. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the glossy photograph of Richard Sterling. The man was smiling, wearing a tailored tuxedo at a charity gala, holding a glass of champagne. But Arthur wasn't looking at the smile. He was looking at the background of the photograph. Standing just over Sterling's left shoulder, partially obscured by a marble pillar, was a man with a prominent cauliflower ear, Yuri Rostova. The Russian hitman Arthur had paralyzed less than 12 hours ago. "Sterling didn't just sell you out," Arthur said softly, his eyes darkening. "He's been coordinating with them for months. This wasn't just a hit. It was a boardroom coup, executed through an assassination." Arthur closed the folder. The history teacher was gone. The Reaper had officially returned to the hunt. The Adirondack safe house was a marvel of paranoid architecture, but for Arthur Pendleton, it was just a staging ground. In the sub-basement armory, surrounded by crates of tactical gear that rivaled the inventory of a small sovereign nation, the high school history teacher methodically stripped away his civilian identity. He selected a lightweight Kevlar-weaved tactical suit, entirely matte black, devoid of insignia. He checked the action on a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol, slotting 3 spare magazines into his harness. He didn't want a firefight. A firefight meant variables, and variables meant risk to Lily. But Richard Sterling had crossed the Rubicon. He had brought the Volkov syndicate to Arthur's doorstep, and in the brutal arithmetic of Arthur's former life, that equation only had one solution. Sylvia Caldwell stood in the doorway of the armory, watching him. She had traded her ruined Armani blazer for a simple cashmere sweater, but the fierce, billionaire intellect in her eyes remained undimmed. Sterling called an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. at the Caldwell Enterprise Tower in Manhattan, Sylvia said, holding out an encrypted tablet. With me presumed missing or dead, he's invoking the contingency succession clause. He plans to freeze the Kestrel Global acquisition and sell the logistics network to a shell company backed by the Volkovs. It's a multi-billion-dollar pivot. If he signs those papers, they gain backdoor access to the shipping routes, supplying microchips from TSMC in Taiwan to defense contractors in Virginia. "So, this isn't just corporate greed," Arthur said, racking the slide of the pistol. "It's a geopolitical play." "Exactly. It's real-world treason, wrapped in a corporate merger. He's partnered with a syndicate that rivals BlackRock in capital, but operates like a cartel." Sylvia stepped closer. "My private security can get you into the building through the subterranean freight tunnels. But Sterling will have his own people, likely Volkov mercenaries, locking down the executive floor. I cannot legally authorize what you are about to do, Arthur." Arthur met her gaze. "You aren't authorizing anything, Miss Caldwell. I am protecting my daughter's future. Sterling is just in the way." He walked past her, pausing only briefly. "Keep Lily occupied. If she asks for me, tell her I went to get her that chocolate dome dessert." By 7:45 a.m., the Caldwell Enterprise Tower on 6th Avenue was a hive of anxious corporate energy. The financial news networks were already running wild speculation about Sylvia Caldwell's disappearance. In the penthouse boardroom on the 65th floor, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Richard Sterling, wearing a pristine Brioni suit, stood at the head of the massive mahogany table. He looked out at the 12 board members, projecting an aura of grave, reluctant leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice perfectly modulated to express sorrow. "We are facing an unprecedented crisis. With Sylvia's whereabouts unknown following last night's horrific incident at L'Espérance, the markets are panicking. Our stock is plummeting. I have a fiduciary duty to stabilize this company." Outside the heavy, soundproof oak doors of the boardroom, 4 men in tailored suits stood guard. They were not Caldwell Enterprise security. They were large, muscular, and carried themselves with the rigid discipline of Spetsnaz veterans. Yuri Rostova's personal cleanup crew. They never even heard the elevator ding. Arthur had bypassed the software on the executive elevator using a master keycard Sylvia provided. He stepped into the plushly carpeted hallway, like a shadow detaching from the wall. The closest guard turned, catching a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. Before he could raise his hand to his earpiece, Arthur was inside his guard. A suppressed, hollow thwip from the H&K pistol shattered the kneecap of the first mercenary. As the man crumpled, Arthur pivoted, driving the reinforced steel toe of his tactical boot into the second guard's sternum, collapsing his diaphragm. The remaining two mercenaries went for their weapons, their training kicking in. But they were fighting a ghost. Arthur dropped into a low slide, snapping a kick through the third guard's ankle, hearing the bones snap, before rising fluidly to press the hot muzzle of his suppressor directly under the chin of the fourth man. The hallway was perfectly silent again, save for the agonized, breathless wheezing of the men on the floor. The entire engagement took less than 4 seconds. "Stay down," Arthur whispered in flawless, unaccented Russian to the man at gunpoint, "or I'll send you back to Moscow in a jar." He disarmed the trembling man, knocked him unconscious with a precise strike to the temple, and stepped over the bodies. He holstered his weapon. He didn't need it for what came next. Inside the boardroom, Richard Sterling was sliding a thick stack of contracts across the table. "This divestment of the Kestrel assets will infuse us with $3 billion in liquid capital. It saves the company. I need your signatures." "I think we should wait for the FBI to conclude their investigation," a nervous board member stammered. "The FBI doesn't manage our quarterly earnings." "David," Sterling snapped, his mask of sorrow slipping to reveal raw arrogance. "Sign the paper." The heavy oak doors clicked, unlatching with a heavy mechanical thud. Sterling looked up, furious. "I said no interruptions." The doors swung open. Arthur Pendleton walked into the boardroom. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear anymore. In the elevator, he had stripped off the Kevlar weave to reveal the slightly blood-spattered corduroy blazer and button-down shirt he had worn the night before. He looked exactly like the terrified civilian he was supposed to be. Sterling frowned, confused. "Who the hell are you? Where is my security?" Arthur walked slowly down the length of the table. He ignored the gasps of the board members. He didn't look at the panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. He kept his eyes locked entirely on Sterling. "They're taking a nap," Arthur said, echoing the words he had spoken to his daughter. He reached into his pocket and tossed a heavy, blood-stained silver Rolex onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly, sliding to a halt right on top of the divestment contracts. Sterling looked at the watch. The color instantly drained from his face. It was Yuri Rostova's watch. "You hired the Volkov Syndicate to murder your boss," Arthur said, his voice quiet, calm, and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You wired 5 million euros to a shell company in Cyprus, and you gave them the exact coordinates of a restaurant where an 8-year-old girl was eating her birthday dinner." "This is insane!" Sterling shouted, stumbling backward, his polished demeanor shattering completely. "Security! Call security!" "I am the security." A crisp, authoritative voice rang out from the doorway. Sylvia Caldwell stepped into the boardroom. She looked immaculate, dressed in a sharp, navy blue power suit. Behind her stood Detective Callahan of the NYPD, alongside 2 agents from the FBI's counter-espionage division. The boardroom erupted into chaos, but Sylvia held up a single hand, silencing the billionaires and executives instantly. "Richard," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt, "did you really think I wouldn't audit the offshore accounts? The FBI has your wire transfers. The NYPD has your syndicate handler in custody, singing like a bird about his inside man to avoid terrorism charges." Sterling looked at the FBI agents advancing toward him with handcuffs. He looked at Sylvia. Then, he looked at Arthur, the unassuming man in the corduroy jacket who had single-handedly dismantled a hostile corporate coup and a Russian hit squad in less than 12 hours. Who are you?" Sterling whispered, his voice trembling as the federal agents wrenched his arms behind his back. Arthur adjusted the lapels of his faded blazer. The lethal, freezing intensity vanished from his eyes, replaced once again by the tired, soft gaze of a single father. "I'm just a high school history teacher," Arthur replied flatly, "and you're going to be a footnote." The NYPD officially classified the boardroom incident as a corporate espionage sting. Richard Sterling was quietly indicted by federal prosecutors. Sylvia Caldwell secured her empire, rivaling the logistical reach of Amazon. As for Arthur Pendleton, he returned to grading history papers in Queens. But now, an armored Maybach subtly patrols his neighborhood, and his daughter's college fund is anonymously endowed by a billionaire who owes them her life.
Hi, my name is Shalom Morel Hunger, the owner and manager of Shalom Morel Hunger. After watching the video, 3 Men Attacked CEO in a Restaurant, Single Dad's Hidden Skill Changed Everything, I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the idea that you never really know what someone has been through or what they're capable of until a difficult moment reveals it. The single dad in the story didn't seem interested in attention or praise. He simply reacted when someone needed help. That quiet sense of responsibility and courage gave the story a lot of emotional weight for me. Do you think most people would step in during a dangerous situation like that, or would fear stop them? And why do you think people often underestimate someone just because they appear ordinary on the surface? I think stories like this remind us that character usually shows itself through actions, not titles, status, or appearances. If this story connected with you, or kept you thinking afterward, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories about resilience, hidden strength, and unexpected heroes, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you'd like to see more.